Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins.
Hey everybody, welcome to Grow the Info. Thank you so much for joining us. So they are going to be swearing in the Supreme Court Chief Justice, who is going to be presiding over the impeachment trial, and they are also going to be swearing in the 7 managers who were appointed by the House of Representatives. And remember, they did bring the articles of impeachment over to the Senate this morning and read through them again. We did a previous stream on the impeachment articles and walked through exactly what they said, and I listed the white papers before, so they are easy-ish to find. I will try to link that stream down below. I might also in the chat room post the white papers of the articles so that you guys can read them for yourselves. We're just gonna watch. This is not the trial itself. This is another step in the trial. So thank you for joining, and let's just keep on watching. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at GrowTheInfo is our name, and Instagram. I keep forgetting about Instagram. And you can check out our website, growtheinfo.com, for all kinds of good information and resources, press releases, great stuff. Make sure that you are subscribed and turn on bell notifications so that you get notified whenever we suddenly go live, like we just did. Thank you for watching, everybody.
Mr. Kane. Present. Mr. Kennedy. Present. Mr. King. Present. Ms. Klobuchar. Present. Mr. Langford. Present. Mr. Leahy. Present. Mr. Lee. Present. Mrs. Loeffler. Present. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Present. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Present. Mr. Portman. Present. Mr. Reed. Present. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Present. Mr. Romney. Present. Ms. Rosen. Present. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Present. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden.
Everyone, I just put in a link to the bill text for the articles of impeachment in the chat room. The bill name is HR 755. You can go to congress.gov and just type that into the search bar and you will be able to find the bill
Young.
text.
A quorum is present under the previous order at the hour of 2 p.m., that time arriving, and a quorum have been established. The Senate will proceed to consideration of the articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, at this time, pursuant to Rule 4 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment and the United States Constitution, the presiding officer will now administer the oath to John G. Roberts, Chief Justice of the United States.
Previous order, the Escort Committee will now conduct the Chief Justice of the United States to the dais to be administered the oath.
Senators, I attend the Senate in conformity with your notice for the purpose of joining with you for the trial of the President of the United States. I am now prepared to take the oath.
Will you place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and the laws, so help you God?
I do.
God bless you.
Thank you very much. At this time, I will administer the oath to all senators in the chamber in conformance with Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution and the Senate's impeachment rules. Will all senators now stand or remain standing and raise their right hand? Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help you God? The clerk will call the names in groups of 4, and senators will present themselves at the desk to sign the oath book.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Leffler, Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young.
Is recognized.
Any senator who was not in the Senate chamber at the time the oath was administered to the other senators will make that fact known to the chair so that the oath may be administered as soon as possible.
The Sergeant in Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent on pain of imprisonment while the House of Representatives is exhibiting to the Senate of the United States articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, for the information of the Senate, on my behalf and that of the distinguished Democratic leader, I'm about to propound several unanimous consent requests that will assist with the organization of the next steps of these proceedings. They deal largely with necessary paperwork incident to the trial. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that the summons be issued in the usual form, provided that the President may have until 6 p.m. on Saturday, January the 18th, 2020, to file his answer with the Secretary of the Senate, which shall be spread upon the Journal, and the House of Representatives have until 12 noon on Monday, January 20th, 2020, to file its replication with the Secretary of the Senate. Finally, I ask consent that the Secretary of the Senate be authorized to print as a Senate document those documents filed by the parties together to be available to all parties.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that if the House of Representatives wishes to file a trial brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 5 p.m. on Saturday, January the 18th, 2020. Further, that if the President wishes to file a trial brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 12 noon on Monday, January 20th, 2020. Further, that if the House wishes to file a rebuttal brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 12 noon on Tuesday, January 21st, 2020. Finally, I ask consent that the Secretary of the Senate be authorized to print as a Senate document all documents filed by the parties together to be available for all parties.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that in recognition of the unique requirements raised by the impeachment trial of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, the Sergeant at Arms shall install appropriate equipment and furniture in the Senate chamber during all times that the Senate is sitting for trial with the Chief Justice of the United States presiding. The appropriate equipment, furniture, and computer equipment in accordance with the allocations and provisions I now send to the desk and ask that they be printed in the record.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate sitting as a court of impeachment adjourn until Tuesday, January the 21st, 2020 at 1 p.m.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The Senate sitting as court of impeachment is adjourned until Tuesday, January 21st at 1 p.m.
Alrighty, so there's that. So everybody is sworn in, they have their proper titles and stuff to be able to begin the impeachment trial next week. And again, they said on Tuesday. So of course we're going to be streaming that because people seem to like watching that. So, you know, and honestly though, if there's something else going on that is more important, they're probably going to have a few rounds of this, and they're going to be talking a lot about the same stuff that they've already gone over. So if there's something else that's really pressing going on that I might not stream it, just to warn you guys, but I am planning on streaming those. And we will probably go through the bill text again before they do the streaming of the hearing. And again, the bill title is HR 755. So if you go to congress.gov and just type that into the search bar that you see at the top, then you will be able to see the bill text. And that's the articles of impeachment that they keep referring to. If you read it, then it details all of the allegations against Mr. Trump and all of the kind of details surrounding it. It gives some background information and stuff too. It is a lengthy read though, just to warn you. So thank you so much for watching, everyone. Let's see if I have, oh, hi Tinfoil. Hi. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining.
Clerk will call the roll.
Oh my goodness.
Alexander.
Oh my goodness. Did you guys hear that? Yeah, of course you did. Hold on, I gotta turn off my other volume thing. Okay, so they are apparently doing other stuff. I don't know what they're doing, but I need to shut off the stream because I gotta go do mom stuff. So, let's see, they do have a stream going on tomorrow. Let's go ahead and look and see what's going on. Let's go to house.gov. Let's see what they have going on tomorrow. Tomorrow, on Friday, they are talking about online platforms and market power. Part 5, competitors in the digital economy. All right, so I will definitely be streaming that, and let's see, that will be about 9 o'clock my time. So you can go ahead and expect me to pull up any kind of papers or anything that I can find on that, like I always do. And we'll go through it, and if I don't find any kind of pertinent information to it, then I'll just go through some press releases or something. So make sure that you're subscribed and turn on the bell notification so that you can be notified tomorrow morning when we go live. And online platforms, curious to see what they're going to be saying in that. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful day. Remember that you can go to our website, growtheinfo.com, for all kinds of good information, press releases, good stuff like that. And you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram to get like recall notices and more timely information. And thank you for joining, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful day.